nothing there to manage traffic except for the pedestrians' kind of own decision making. Overall, we collected a lot of data. First, we collected data about the car's movement. So from the CAN, things like the speed, the steering wheel angle, the brake pedal being pressed, etc. We also had an IMU that measured the exact acceleration throughout each run. We also had cameras, 3 at the crosswalk to get from different angles and 5 on the vehicle to measure or to capture any element of an interaction that we could. And as I said before, we also had interviews. So these had both quad.
Yeah, it's so creepy, dude.
So I think it's safe to say that this is a pretty convincing illusion, and that people's reactions range from not noticing the car at all to some more interesting reactions, and I have a few more clips to show you in a second. So results, how do people feel about a polite, human-like autonomous vehicle approaching a crosswalk? First thing I want to headline is that 100% of people crossed in front of the car, even though it didn't have any explicit EHMI. And we even had several sentences like this one that said it acknowledged me and stopped better than a human would. And I'd like to think that says I'm a good driver. One thing we coded with, or you might think that people might pause or hesitate before crossing, more likely in front of our car than, say, other cars on the road, other regular cars. And so we looked at that in the video and found that while there was a slight difference, so here we have the likelihood of people crossing in front of our car or the ghost driver car. And goodness, it's cut off. In this group, we have people who, or times where the car arrived at the crosswalk before the pedestrian got there. In this group, we have instances where the pedestrian was already at the crosswalk or in the crosswalk before the car came to a full stop. And we see that there's an important, or a bigger difference here, where if people are already at the crosswalk before the car gets there, they're more likely to hesitate before crossing just to make sure the car will stop. This makes sense. We see a slight increase in the number of people that hesitate before crossing in front of our car compared to other cars on the road, but that wasn't a statistically significant difference in the end. Another measure that we had was this index of interaction quality. And this was a combination of items from our interviews. Things like the interaction was pleasant, safe, and comfortable. And this ranged on a scale from 1 to 5. And then here, horizontally, we have the distance to the crosswalk. So how far away was the car when it came to a full stop? And overall, we see pretty high scores. Most of them are in the 4 to 5 range. We see a little bit more variance here up close. When we get within 5 feet of the crosswalk, there's a bit more variance, but of course it's not a ton of data points. When we asked people what was the car driven by, did you think the car was driven by a human or driven autonomously? About 65% said they perceived the car as autonomous before crossing. 20% said conventional, and the rest were unsure. We didn't see a significant difference between these groups, and that was a total of 47 interviews. So overall, this is a pretty positive result. The next thing we looked at was how clear was the car's intent. So these were an index of interview items like the car's aware of me, it wanted me to keep walking, it wanted me to take my time, I knew it would stop for me, and that it was trustworthy. And again, we see fairly high scores, especially close to the crosswalk. This is the same measure here from 1 to 5, 5 being good. Horizontally is the distance away from the crosswalk. And we see, again, pretty high scores. The intent was slightly clearer overall when the car was closer to the crosswalk, which is interesting and really makes sense. Interestingly, though, the intent was marginally less clear for people who saw the car as being driven by a human rather than being driven autonomously, which is the opposite of what you might expect. So overall, this is a pretty positive result as well. But next, I'll show you a couple more clips. This first video represents a really common sentiment that we saw in the interviews, and I'll let you listen to it and then describe a little bit about it.
I think it feels more natural if there's a person driving and you know that the person actively stops for you. Probably you could get used to it if you see it all the time.
So, of course, seeing a driverless vehicle on the road, which for most people it was probably their first driverless vehicle, it can be a little bit unsettling. But we saw that people, just because people aren't used to it, they didn't necessarily, after having one interaction with it, have the same maybe unsure, insecurity or negative feelings towards the car. And so it's possible that through just one interaction, people's mental model, if they even have one, of how these autonomous vehicles can behave and will or won't hit them, can shift. Just because people don't have exposure to these cars in general. In this next clip, you'll see a bit more of an interesting reaction. I want to say that this is definitely a minority. Most people react perfectly fine. And you'll see that they hesitate a bit before crossing, but they still understand what the car is going to do and end up crossing.
Oh my God!
So obviously it was interesting and entertaining. There's a strong novelty effect here, and this is the kind of thing that we wouldn't see if we were doing this in a controlled study as much. This is one of the biggest benefits of this type of field study where you're going up to random people on the street, because you get really unprimed reactions to the car. And even though they were a bit unsure, maybe, I don't know about scared, is really the right word, but they still crossed in front of the car. And this is the last video for this study, and this was also a less common response. For this one, I want you to keep an eye on the person's gestures and the timing of when they react to the car.
When I saw the visual driver, I was kind of freaked out. It was like a very smooth car. What? But sort of my rational brain thinks that if it's programmed to stop for pedestrians, my bet is it would do a better job than real drivers.
So again, of course, we see that she was a little surprised, but if you notice, she waved at the car while she was halfway through the crosswalk, and then noticed that it was autonomous and reacted. So she made her decision to cross not based on anything about the car's perceived autonomy, just that it had stopped for her. And again, you see this shift of mental model where it was a little strange, but if you think about it, these cars should be better than humans, eventually, if not now, at yielding to pedestrians. So overall, we saw really favorable responses to the Ghost Driver car. 100% of people crossed without any explicit EHMI. People who reacted tend to react after the car had already stopped. And whereas there seems to be a novelty effect here, people didn't seem genuinely scared of the vehicle or unsure that was ever going to stop them. So next, how can an engine sound enhance interactions with the car? We didn't see, honestly, a big problem in this first study because everybody crossed in front of the car. But we were still interested in this idea of adding engine sound. And this was motivated by regulations that are coming in both the US and the EU, requiring electric vehicles to have sound for pedestrians at low speeds. Here's an example from Nissan of what their sound will be like, maybe. And so inspired by this sound, as well as a bunch of other common chords in music, as well as some of my favorite composers, because I'm a musician, we created a bunch of candidate engine sounds. We transposed them so that they all had the same lowest pitch, because we thought the pitch could be a significant factor. And then we had the sound shift down an octave while slowing down to indicate that the car was going to stop. And this was inspired by some of our earlier work with robots, where we did some online studies of varying the sound of the motor sound of a robot and seeing that changing the pitch does make people perceive the robot as slowing down, even if it's moving at the same speed. So here's an example, this first one on the top right, which is from Eric Whitaker, one of my favorite composers. And I don't have time to go into all the details, but we did use similar methods that I had prototyped earlier in my dissertation to decide which of these 14 sounds was the best sound for this particular application. And the one that people liked the best was this open chord. So it just said F, C, F. It didn't have a third. It didn't have anything that made it major or minor. And overall, these open chords tended to fare better in the study, which to me was a really interesting finding. And so we took this sound and implemented it on the car, just reading the speed of the car, sending that speed to an iPhone app, and then sending the sound that was generated on the app to a Bluetooth speaker under the hood of the car. Surprisingly, the hood acted, or not surprisingly, but the hood acted as a resonator, so it actually made it very convincing that it was an engine sound because you couldn't really tell where the sound was coming from. Here's what that sounded like on the road. So we did have to increase the pitch a couple of octaves, though we kept the same tone, because it was really hard to hear at the lower pitches in the field. So what did we find running the exact same experiment on the same roads with the same interview protocol and everything? We didn't find, again, we measured the hesitation before crossing. We didn't find a significant difference between the conditions. So here, the conventional car, the Ghost Driver baseline, and the Ghost Driver sound. The sound condition, there was slightly fewer people who hesitated before crossing, which could be due to the sound, but it wasn't a significant difference. We did find for a measure of interaction quality, which was this idea of how safe and comfortable the interaction was, that adding the engine sound did have a significant effect. And so this to us is really great, that potentially adding the sound made the interaction better. Even though when we asked people, even only about a quarter of participants mentioned the sound in the interviews, unprompted or prompted. Also, in our measure of intent, the car's intent to stop, this is also significantly higher, which is also interesting. Here's an example of a clip of someone who noticed the sound and commented on it in their interview.
The first thing I noticed was the noise, the projecting sound. I've seen other cars like that, projecting sort of sound too. I think that's a good idea to get people used to it. My competition got back to drive, pick and drive. I was feel safer stepping on front of one of them than other people who drive around campus.
So this is kind of more of a reaction you might expect from people. Autonomous vehicles will probably be better than humans at this. But he noticed the sound and he liked the sound. So it was nice to see that come out in the interviews. Now, adding the sound, of course, didn't solve every problem. In this next clip, you'll see how this person reacted. Again, look at how he looks at the car and responds to the car while crossing the street. It's kind of hard to hear this one. So he said, "I'm surprised it stopped," which to me is a surprising comment because these vehicles should be good at this. But what this suggests is that while some people do have a high trust in autonomous vehicles, other people don't. Did increase the quality of the interaction. Few pedestrians were aware of it, it seemed, even though it did have an effect overall. The varied pitch made it much more audible in the field to discern from the surrounding hum of the environment. We also did have a couple instances, like the video I showed you, that people were surprised at the vehicle's ability and their trust in it. This probably had little to do with the sound itself, but we tended to have a few more instances of weird behavior in this sound condition. It could be that the sound drew more attention to the car, or it could just be a coincidence, we don't really know. So what do these results suggest for how autonomous vehicles should stop for pedestrians at crosswalks? This first plot is the distance that both conventional cars and our car stopped away from the crosswalk. And the width here of this violin plot represents the density, so more points here than at the end. And as you can see, there's actually a pretty big range. Anywhere from stopping, negative distance for us was inside the crosswalk to, up to 20 feet away. And so there's quite a range here. So what are the factors that might influence this? One was this arrival order. So if cars stopped at the crosswalk before pedestrians got there, they tended to stop a little closer than if the pedestrian was already there or in the crosswalk by the time they got there. Which isn't a surprising result. but something that people could use to design this. We did ask people in the interviews, did the car stop too close, just right, or too far? And that's this axis here, and horizontally we have the distance to the crosswalk when the car stopped. And the main result from this was that 79% of people said that it was just right regardless of where it stopped. So it wasn't necessarily a factor that a lot of people were sensitive to. We did have some people who said slightly too close was between 4 and 9 feet, and slightly too far was between 5 and 19 feet. So other factors are really important besides just the absolute stopping distance of the car to the crosswalk. So that could be things like this, which is the speed profile of the car. So for each, as I said earlier, we captured each of the speed profiles of the car as it approached the crosswalk. And here the color represents whether the brake pedal was being pressed or not. And there was a significant difference between exiting and entering the roundabout just because of the different speeds. Now we have a few kind of stragglers here that represent being in traffic. So if we remove those, we get a bit of a cleaner curve here of what that more consistent stopping profile might be, and we can use this to compare and design different vehicle approaches. One interesting thing, though, is that stopping might not always be the best behavior. We thought this was the most appropriate behavior to people, the most polite. But when we looked at what cars do, they don't always stop. So first, if the car arrives at the crosswalk before the pedestrian, we always stopped. But conventional cars generally stopped or came to a crawl, that's this blue, or maybe didn't yield, that's not a good thing. When the pedestrian arrived first, there was a lot more variance. So less than half of people actually came to a full stop at the crosswalk before continuing on. A lot of people just slowed or crawled. And, however, again, we came to a full stop much more than other people because we thought this was the right behavior. So what this tells us is that we should look at other behaviors maybe besides just stopping, because it might actually be more natural to not stop at a crosswalk. So all in all, what does this tell us about the future, or what are the implications for autonomous vehicle development? The current trajectory of EHMI development kind of looks like this, which this is from an Uber patent application. And as you can see, they're trying to just patent any technology they can, a display, a projector, a virtual driver, anything like that. Now, it's not that all this would be on one exact car. We would hope that there would be some standards and that different brands wouldn't decide to use different signals. But it does have the potential to be, this kind of thing does have the potential to be a cacophony if it ends up going this far. Now, I hope it doesn't. But what this work suggests is that the implicit EHMI, the motion and the sound of the car alone, can, in most situations, do what those signals are designed to do. So we showed that detectable changes in the motion can convey intent, and also that replacing eye contact with a display isn't necessary in all situations for driverless vehicles. So the lack of driver cues probably isn't as big of a problem as people think. We did find that adding the artificial engine sound increased the interaction quality and clarity of intent of the car. And I think what this suggests to me is that even if we do need explicit EHMI, we should take this implicit EHMI as far as possible and really understand the specific instances where some kind of display will be required to negotiate between the pedestrian and the car. This work also contributes methodologically some things that can help future studies in this area.